Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 3 and the final game of the Sharks Rookie Faceoff tournament, in which they took on the Los Angeles Kings and lost by a score of 3-0, getting shut out in the final game of this tournament. And some people may be wondering, well, how is it that the Sharks went from winning their two previous games and then getting shut out in the third one? Well, clearly, if you take a look at the lineup here, the Sharks maybe didn't necessarily put their best foot forward. No offense to the players iced tonight against the Los Angeles Kings, but it's pretty clear that the Sharks went with a bit of a weaker lineup here, as they ended up benching their three best players of the tournament: Ryan Merkley, William Eklund, and Thomas Bordeleau, in no particular order, I should say, for that one. Meanwhile, looking at the Los Angeles Kings side, while I am not super familiar with their prospect system, I do know that players like Quinton Byfield and Brandt Clark, who both dressed here tonight for the Kings, are very, very good players, so it can definitely be said that they didn't go as easy as the Sharks did. Now, before we head into this one, I do want to mention that with the tournament coming to an end, there were a small handful of players who actually ended up playing in all three games for the San Jose Sharks. Those players are Ethan Cardwell, Daniil Gushchin, Brandon Coe, Ozzy Wiseblatt, Max Mchugh, and Jake Furlong. Now, it should be noted that this doesn't necessarily mean that these six players were the best players for the San Jose Sharks this weekend, and Eklund, Bordeleau, and Merkley were so disappointing that they couldn't even play in all three games. Not so much. It's kind of just that after those first couple of games, we already kind of know what we're expecting from Eklund, from Bordeleau, from Merkley. They don't necessarily need that third game. Meanwhile, players like Cardwell, like Coe, like Furlong, like Mchugh, these players are extremely interesting, and they haven't necessarily slotted into where they're going to fall in the Sharks organization going into this next year, or I guess you could say the Barracuda situation going into next year, and so they needed this extra game. Clearly, they played a good tournament to actually get all three, but it also means that they're not necessarily massive considerations going into the next season. So let us start off here on the first line with Ethan Cardwell. He managed to work his way up from the third line in Game 1 all the way up to this first line, and potentially even being the Sharks' best forward of the game here tonight. It was definitely an extremely hard-working forward, doesn't take a shift off, really gets into it, not at the same sort of style as Ozzy Wiseblatt, who I also gave these types of compliments to. Wiseblatt is more so the physical style of presence, so when he really gets into it, I mean he's getting into it physically. Cardwell kind of shies away from that part of the game, which is not actually a bad thing, it's just something to note, but he clearly is constantly hounding after the puck, really trying to get in positions to score. We saw him get a couple of opportunities, a couple of breakaways/partial breakaways in here tonight, and while he didn't manage to convert on those, it was a pretty solid weekend for Cardwell, all things considered. We'll see what happens with him going into the next season. Will he return to juniors, or will he end up playing in the AHL with the Barracuda? The other winger on this line was Daniil Gushchin, and while I mentioned that Cardwell was likely the best forward for the San Jose Sharks here tonight, Gushchin was probably the most skilled forwards sort of dressed, not necessarily considering tonight, especially with Eklund and Bordeleau on the bench. Gushchin clearly has a lot of high-end talent in his game, and he showed that off a couple of times this weekend. In particular, if we're talking about this game, there were about 3 shifts here tonight where you really saw Gushchin stand out. He's holding the puck, he's handling it extremely well, he's playing keep away against the Los Angeles Kings defenders, and generally he's really stood out quite well. But then there were also about a dozen other shifts where you're like, oh, Gushchin was on the ice, I barely even noticed him there, which is just the major issue of consistency that I mentioned after Game 2 when it comes to his game. And so the general consensus here when it comes to Daniil Gushchin, I would say for myself, is that he's either going to become like a solid top 6 contributor for the San Jose Sharks, maybe like a Alex Barabanov type level, if not even slightly higher than that, or he's just never going to make it to the Sharks roster. So in 3 years, maybe we're going to be talking about him as a consistent forward for the Sharks, and in 3 years, maybe we're all going to forget about his name. I don't really think there's any sort of middle ground that there might be with a player like Cardwell, who seems like, if he can continue on this solid development track, he very well could be, let's say, a 4th liner for the San Jose Sharks in a couple of years. The final player on this line was Scott Reedy, who I thought actually had a pretty disappointing tournament, all things considered. He did not play the second game, but he did play the first one and found himself on a top line with Eklund and Bordeleau. And that night, Bordeleau and Eklund stood out so heavily that I made the comment that maybe Reedy actually did have a pretty good game. He was just overshadowed by his two line mates. And so going into the game here tonight, I was expecting that maybe we could see Reedy stand out a bit more, considering his two line mates were unlikely to overshadow him, and also the fact that Reedy does have maybe the most NHL experience under his belt out of any of the players at the camp. I don't exactly know if he's played more games than Ryan Merkley in his NHL career, and yet he didn't really stand out all that much. I was really expecting a solid performance, but maybe there was just some laziness because of the fact that he feels as though his spot with the San Jose Sharks is already quite secure, but he really shouldn't feel that, especially with a lot of the players who just got brought in by Mike Grier during this offseason. It's actually very, very possible, if not likely, that Reedy finds himself in the AHL next season, and so I was expecting a big performance from him here this weekend, and we didn't get anything like that. Reedy was barely noticeable in the two games he actually played. When it comes to the second line, let's talk about Brandon Coe, who had, all things considered, a relatively disappointing and quiet tournament. I would say his first game, it was quite bad. His second game was definitely an improvement, but the third game here that was supposed to break the tie, it wasn't necessarily all that great. So I won't say he was generally bad in this tournament, but for a player who stood out with over 100 points in the OHL just last season, as a bigger guy who you're expecting to still be able to kind of dominate players here at this rookie tournament, he really didn't do anything like that. And if I didn't know that he was a player with 100 points in juniors last season, I would have never really thought twice about him watching his performance this weekend. When it comes to Ozzy Wiseblatt, he certainly had a big start to the tournament. I remember tweeting out after the first period of game one how much of a firecracker he was, and that while some people would be watching Eklund and Bordeleau, including myself, a player to keep an eye on was Ozzy Wiseblatt because he seemed to be coming in under the radar. But as the tournament progressed, didn't necessarily keep up that same level. Basically, over the last couple of games, when you would notice Wiseblatt, it would be, of course, part of these altercations that he would really get into physically with the other players on the other team. But in terms of actual offensive contributions and making plays for himself, there wasn't necessarily a ton of it. And while I like to see, that physical part of his game, like how there was generally a massive push from most of the Sharks players here on this roster trying to make a note physically on the games, which is why these games kind of got a bit out of control a bit at times from a San Jose Sharks perspective. Wiseblatt does need to still bring in that offensive element if he really wants to be able to make it to the NHL at some point. And while there was some of that early on, it kind of tapered off later. And then finally, I do also want to mention the centerman centering these two players in Josh Lawrence. I thought he had an okay game, but the issue that I see with Lawrence is actually his size. And I don't usually, I guess you could say, discriminate against players based on their size, because I believe that, a bigger player and a smaller player, if they have the skill, that they can make it to the NHL. But the problem is that Lawrence doesn't really have that super high-end skill that makes you think, well, this guy could clearly make it to the NHL. And when you're playing in a centerman position, especially being a 5'9" player who maybe even looks slightly smaller than that on the ice, he really did stick out because of his size. Being a 5'9" centerman, it's very difficult to be able to pull off without that super high-end talent. A winger may have been able to do so, but a center, you're not going to have as much of ease with that. So while he actually had a decent last couple of games here of this rookie tournament, playing in both games 2 and 3, he's not necessarily someone who I could really see panning out for the San Jose Sharks at any point, sadly for him. When it comes to the third line, honestly, I'm not going to mention basically everybody on the roster here tonight because it was such a muted performance from the San Jose Sharks that there are a couple of players, for instance, like Lewinsky, I mentioned just last game, who didn't really do much of anything here tonight, but a couple of players who I do want to mention. The first one would be Mitchell Russell, someone who kind of stood out for me in game 1 as a surprise player who I didn't really know much about going into this tournament. And again, I thought he also had a very solid performance here tonight in this third game. Clearly had a decent bit of trust from the coaching staff, got some shifts 6-on-5 when the Sharks were trying to get back into the game before the Kings scored that empty netter to really put it away. And so generally, Mitchell Russell, a pretty solid weekend for him. And then the final player to mention on the forward side in my eyes would be Max Mchugh. Like I mentioned earlier, is one of the players who got all 3 games this weekend. A solid defensive player for the San Jose Sharks, could potentially pan out as a bottom 6 guy, had some solid penalty killing moments, since, and since the San Jose Sharks were frequently penalty killing throughout this weekend, like I mentioned earlier, the games kind of got away from them at times. A lot of pretty rough hits, I would say, and really undisciplined penalties. Mchugh was put into these positions to try and penalty kill, and he did a pretty admirable job at that. On the defensive side of things, we had the first pairing of Hatakka and Smith, and I was really expecting Hatakka to kind of take over this game. In the previous two, of course, it was Ryan Merkley, the number one guy for the San Jose Sharks, but with him being benched here tonight, I thought Hatakka, with his albeit brief NHL experience, he would be able to take over and really control this rookie game and at least make something happen. But honestly, it was also a pretty disappointing game from him, I would say. He was better earlier on in this tournament, so he's not as disappointing as Reedy was, for instance. But here tonight, I mean, just early in the third period, there was this one particular shift where I believe Hatakka had 3 separate giveaways on just one shift, which was extremely disappointing to see. I was definitely expecting more from him, and for a player who was probably hoping to challenge for a potential roster spot on the team, I didn't think he'd actually be able to get one, but him being, let's say, a 7th or 8th defenseman was certainly not out of the question. But with the performance here, he'll have to definitely step it up in the preseason if he wants to be able to earn that spot. The next player who I do want to talk about would actually be Furlong, because while he started this game on the third pairing with Mayer, he actually swapped places with Smith as the game wore on. Furlong was, as I mentioned, one of the players who played all 3 games this weekend, and he certainly deserved it. He worked his way up from being a player who I really didn't know much about going into that first game and not necessarily super impressing me, to being one of the better defensemen of the weekend. Still extremely young, definitely still has a lot of time to develop, and he's not expected to be a San Jose Sharks player. He almost, I will say, you know what, 100% certainty he's not going to make it into a San Jose Sharks jersey for a regular season game this season, but he doesn't have to be, considering how young he is. Maybe in 3 years he could be a player for the San Jose Sharks. Certainly showed some promise in this tournament. And then a couple other players I do want to mention come onto the second defensive pairing here. Guriev was a player I mentioned as a very big surprise after the second game, where I thought he stood out in a positive light, but he kind of canceled that out here tonight. A couple of undisciplined penalties in the first period, and generally was just a bit worse. Reminds me of sort of an Ethan Cardwell style, where he's really pushing the pace every single time he's on the ice, which is nice to see, but sometimes that caught him out of position and things like that. So it was all in all an okay weekend, but it would have been nice to see him finish it strong. And then finally, I will mention Kanyazev, who also was given an opportunity to really step up as a number 1 defenseman here today with the benching of Ryan Merkley for this game. And I thought he was kind of similar to what Merkley does, in that he was extremely up and down, had multiple moments where he's holding the puck and you go, this guy clearly has a lot of offensive talent. But of course, there were a couple of moments in the defensive zone, as well as an extremely undisciplined penalty that he took, where you say, well, there's clearly some development still to come along. So Kanyazev, there was technically a chance he could make it to the Sharks roster if he was extremely impressive through this rookie tournament as well as preseason, but I imagine he'll just be one of the top guys on the Barracuda defensive side of things. And then finally, when it comes to the goaltending, we had Benjamin Goodrow. The Sharks had 3 different goaltenders play all 3 games throughout this rookie tournament. Goodrow he was okay, certainly made a lot of very solid saves, and his first goal that he gave up, he basically had no chance on. Really what sours his performance here today was just that second goal, where he just made a very, very poor read. Looked like he was going to come out of his net to play the puck, but then hesitated, was holding his stick in an extremely awkward position, which made it very difficult to then get cut across the crease to make a save on the incoming wraparound, which allowed the Kings to get the 2-0 lead. Of course, he got 0 goal support, and so even if he didn't let in that second goal, the Sharks still would have lost, but it still is a goal that kind of sours what would have otherwise been a pretty solid performance. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action next week when preseason starts. At this point, the rookie tournament is coming to an end. I will say players who were standing out for me, obviously the usual suspects of Eklund, Bordelot, and Ryan Merkley, but also players like Max Mchugh and Jake Furlong really, I thought, had solid weekends. Players who were somewhat more of a disappointment, I would point to Scott Reedy as well as Brandon Coe. Class dismissed.